Well, firstly, we'd like to welcome you all to the Advancing Change in Disruptive Times. It's a webinar with Sylvia Cheuy and Sonja Miokovic of Tamarack. We're so pleased that so many of you have joined us today to explore and share insights about the challenges and opportunities of advancing change in disruptive times. So first up, we have Sylvia Cheuy. She is the Consulting Director of Collective Impact with the Tamarack Institute's Learning Center, who has spent more than 20 years championing positive change, citizen-led change efforts, and brings practical knowledge and firsthand experience to the work of collective impact and community change. Secondly, we have Sonja Miokovic of Tamarack's Consulting Director of Community Innovation. She's a dynamic educator, social scientist, the innovator with over 16 years of experience working alongside public, private, and civil society sectors. She's known for bringing larger than life initiatives into being and thrives on building meaningful relationships and connecting the dots in innovative ways.
Grace. Welcome, everyone. I am so thrilled to have you all with us this afternoon and really happy to be co-hosting this webinar with you, Sonja. Many of you don't know, but Sonja's probably the newest addition to our consulting director team at the Learning Center, and it's just so much fun to be learning with and from you, so that's going to be great. You know, we've certainly been hearing lots about how communities are really having to confront disruption to all the different complex and interconnected issues that are showing up in community. And so I can't imagine a better time to have you and your experience around community innovation added to the team. So welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Sylvia. You're always so gracious. I'm delighted to be joining my first ever Tamarack webinar as co-host with the talented Sylvia and the team on a topic that really gets me excited about the unlimited potential of people and communities. I think particularly, as you alluded to now, is definitely a pertinent time to be dissecting and analyzing disruption to better understand what it means to all of our realities. Coming out of the pandemic, one of the biggest disruptors of our time, what I'm most interested in is how can we best prepare ourselves, our communities, and our teams to thrive in the face of uncertainty? What are the skills that are required, and how can we actively move with disruption and change instead of against it, which seems to be some of a reaction. But anyways, this era of disruption requires us to think creatively, source new solutions and ways of thinking, which is what we want to explore a little bit today. Which is why I think it is particularly an exciting time for community innovators, as many of the characteristics needed to thrive in uncertainty cohabitate the innovation space. So we're going to explore a little bit through our conversations and dialogue how that's connected. As we dive into the content, though, I just wanted to reiterate, we welcome everyone to participate and share their ideas. So if you have anything you'd like to add or something in particular that interests you, please do so in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. We'll be guiding the session with some frameworks, approaches, and key provocations, but we truly value your participation and contribution, so please don't be shy. So let's start with disruption. Let's start with a reflection on the word itself, and let's unpack disruption and what it means, particularly in our context. So the word disruption has a strong and forceful air to it, but on the most basic level, it doesn't mean to cause chaos or disorder, but rather denotes replacing the usual or norm with something new. I know that sometimes the word can be a little bit intimidating from some of the conversations I'm having because it's so, it's so disruptive. So I think it's good to just put it in another light. In terms of disruptive innovation, this is another term that gets used a lot, and it refers to the creation of new products or services, as well as tech that provide a low-cost alternative to forgotten consumers or a new offering to the market. Now, the concept of disruptive change is useful for making sense of an increasingly uncertain world and the responses it demands. The term itself originated in the business management community, referring to a sudden shock that quickly and irreversibly changes a company's expected future, challenges existing business models, values, and norms. For these shocks and for the purposes of our conversation today, they can be seen as economic crises, the pandemic, maybe an innovative competitor when it comes to the private sector that disrupts the market share balance. Some quick examples of this, just in the flow of looking at it from the kind of tech and business side before we dive into our sector, would include, what Airbnb did to the hospitality business, what Uber did to the taxi industry, what Netflix did to Blockbuster, and the list goes on. These were all trailblazers of the specific type of disruption. And in all of these examples, what we see is long-standing industries and leadership falling down. Perhaps these companies got too comfortable holding their market share and thought they were invincible, or perhaps they just didn't see the future coming. But then again, most of us don't. So the question that we explore is how do we prepare ourselves for these disruptions? But let's funnel this larger definition into what disruption means into our context as community change makers. So within our context of community development, the term disruptive change has been more broadly applied to encompass mega trends over time. It also helps explore the landscape and what are some of the drivers that affect our organizational realities. So for example, we have climate change, tech transformations, maybe demographics, geopolitical shifts and things like this. But then we're also facing, issues with funding, with staff turnover and some of the administrative and internal disruptions that we're facing. Next slide, please. So disruption is definitely not something new. It's something that's happening at a much quicker and more rapid rate than we've been used to. And that seems to be becoming more and more of the constant. So can we thrive in an environment of uncertainty? And if so, how? If you have some ideas you'd like to share, we can explore, please put them in the chat here. So what could this look like? Mark Kabaj, a Tamarack associate and president of the Here to There Consulting, has this graphic. And I thought we could use the pandemic, given how fresh it is to all of us still, to explore how we respond and how we move from stability into uncertainty. So there's this notion when there's a disruption that we might return to the old equilibrium, the way that things used to be. And I think it's interesting to reflect on all of our experiences over the last few years of, what was that vision that we wanted to return to? And actually, is it possible? I don't know about the rest of you, but it seems more and more that, returning to the old ways is not only not possible, but has its other challenges. The second kind of way of navigating is to, go through the disruption, but we find a new equilibrium. How can we, make our way through this into a new way? And then the third, navigation is the opportunity to manage a new equilibrium. So if there's going to be constant disruptions, as we're seeing more and more, how do we best prepare ourselves for this ongoing uncertainty? And can perhaps this be an opportunity for us to explore in our communities, which is another question I'd love to get more insight to from everybody participating. So these are only 3 possible paths to move forward. So there's likely many more variations, especially since this was, really deep into the in the midst of COVID, and now we're coming out and we're seeing some of the complications. So yeah, what do you think about this? Are we missing an emergent path? If so, please, again, feel free to add it into the chat. Next slide, please. So this is pulling from an article written by Liz Weaver, co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, where she responds to the 3 main stages, or describes the 3 main stages of navigating disruption. So these are the phases that we've gone through, and we can explore what they mean and what the potential might be. At first, it's the immediate response. The rules, how do we react? A very minimal type of leadership in some ways, mobilization. And we want to make sure we're responding. Is my family okay? Is the organization functioning the way it can? What can we deliver, what we can't? So it's like kind of figuring out the logistics at the first phase. The second phase or the second stage is about recovery. So now we're at a point where we can pause and reflect what needs to change and what needs to stay the same. It kind of gives us an opportunity to be reevaluating our core purposes and exploring how we might leverage our assets and capabilities. And the third phase stage, which I find particularly exciting and one that I'd love to explore more, is building and deepening resiliency. So does this disruption and constant disruption, and particularly this pandemic, offer us an opportunity to dive deeper and to really reconstruct the systems? Does it open up opportunities for more change? And how does that look, and how can we adapt to that? Next slide, please. An interesting, here we have some characters, some Chinese characters, and it's an interesting perspective because it's bringing together two sides of what disruption can mean. We have danger and precariousness, and we have an opportunity for change. And I just think conceptually, this is an interesting summary in terms of what disruption brings and what can we make of it. Next slide, please. So here we have the line, 3 potential responses to disruptive change, and where do we fall on this? And I think going through the pandemic and all the different experiences that we have, we probably go all over the place. But we have here this line of getting by and getting through a disruption and becoming a survivor. But how do we choose, or what are the experiences that we had being, navigating this and seeing an opportunity in it, or seeing some of the challenges and becoming a victim in light of this response? I think there's a lot of natural responses to this. I wonder in the chat if we could add some comments on the responses to this disruptive change. Hold on, let me just take a peek here. I found that at the beginning of the big disruption, I don't know if that is going to be turned that eventually, coined that. I seemed to be very, and I think a lot of my colleagues felt the same way as well, is that there was this enthusiasm or this excitement of what could be, what the opportunity was, and it was almost a time to pause, even though so much was happening. But I think throughout, the fact that it has lasted so long, many of us have wavered up and down between these two sides of the line. Sylvia, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think for me, the thing that really comes out is a couple of things. One is it's really a choice, right? About where do I want to be? But also I'm aware there are times and spaces in my life where I feel more proactive, and then other places where it's easy to fall into victim. So just noticing, where am I at? What's my dominant? When I'm feeling in this really proactive space, what are the things that help hold me there? Or when I'm feeling victim, and want to move more into a proactive space, what helps me shift? And also just noticing as a team, right? This is the power of team for me as well. Some of us have natural affinities to one or the other, and having a good balance is helpful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have someone in the chat that said they would call a navigator an innovator, which is important.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that I would agree with that. I think
I would second that as well. Also, someone said also the victim might be the first response that we jump from into another. That's interesting as well.
It also brings up a theme for me that I've seen others post in the chat, which is this, even though we're experiencing the same disruption, it's impacting us differently, right? Different people are greater or lesser, have borne more or less of the impact. And so I think it's also that, and remembering with sensitivity that maybe if that's the space I'm in, that's the best I'm doing, and it's not for me. And it's not wrong. It's just where I'm at, and mindful that not everybody is always going to show up in that same space.
Yes, absolutely. We can go to the next slide. There's some interesting comments in the chat as well. So next, we have a question for our audience. We'd like to know what are some of the disruptions you're currently seeing and how this is impacting you. We've been kind of touching a little bit on, the pandemic as an overall. I mean, that's a huge disruptor, but I'm curious as to what are some of the other disruptions under that kind of main umbrella, or anything else that you're currently seeing in your work, in your environment, in your communities, and how this is impacting you, if you can share that in the chat.
One of the things I'm noticing as well, many of you are saying you're working with clients who are extremely vulnerable, right? And really need a lot more support and presence from you. I know from other groups that I've worked with as well, the first, one of the first ways many of us sort of adapted was to go online. And not everybody has access to the same level of technology or the same level of comfort. Seniors is a perfect example. Those on low income that may have one cell phone between everyone in the whole family, and these are things that I don't think we really had time to think a lot about and come up with some really creative solutions around.
Yeah, I completely agree. We have someone in the chat saying they're really interested in resiliency. And definitely that is a kind of reaction or outcome of some of these disruptions, and how do we build, again, the teams and the work to really make us resilient. There's the idea of building individual capacity, which feels like shifting the work while creating space and redundancy. When times are good, creates overall strength, and lacking capacity in some of the systems, such as the healthcare system here as well.
One of the other things I'm really noticing many of you commenting on, which is the shifting environment, anger, protests, disruptions of supply chain, all of those kinds of things, really seeing inequities kind of really shining through more obviously than perhaps we were aware of before. Extreme weather, someone's also bringing in, because of climate change, is another dimension that is disruptive. So it's not just one issue, the pandemic, that might be creating it, right? You're seeing that intersection of several different things, which I think is really interesting.
Great. There's a lot of great comments still coming in. As we read through those, Sylvia, I don't know if you want to set us up or dive us into this exploration of the paradigm pioneer and what that.
Yeah, that would be great. Grace, if you can pop us into the next slide. So I don't know how many of you have been following the work of Meg Wheatley, but I know I'm a fan. And one of her, it's quite dated now actually, essays that has always stuck with me though, is this notion of what she calls the paradigm pioneer. And when I look at this first slide, one of the things that she was noting, even a decade or more ago, is that our systems that we've relied on are starting to fail us. And I was talking to a social service provider the other day that I've been doing some work with, and he said, one of the things that we are certainly seeing is maybe these systems were disrupted, like they were not functioning. And maybe that's because in some ways, if we really want to admit it, they were kind of designed that way. And that's problematic. But whether they were designed intentionally to not be equitable, or whether or not we're just seeing the limitations of them, he made another really interesting observation. Just because we can all acknowledge, ooh, looks like our current systems need to be redesigned, does not automatically translate into us having a really clear and shared understanding of what that should look like, right? And I think that's where, from my perspective, Sonja, the stuff around really bringing an innovation lens to community work is particularly relevant right now. If we can pop to the next slide. Yes. This term that really resonates for me, borrowed from Meg Wheatley, is this notion of the paradigm pioneer. So if our current paradigm isn't working, right, maybe we need to send out some trailblazers to go out and be protected in some ways, to do some advanced work for the rest of us, right? To free themselves and have some protected time and energy to reimagine what opportunities or new systems could look like, given what we know, given what the limitations are, given the current environment. And I think it's really interesting because I don't think I think it's very hard sometimes to toggle between the two, like keeping the current system running, which is absolutely essential, as many of the comments have said, right? In terms of people's level of vulnerability, people's real need and dependence, even if the services and programs that we are offering, we acknowledge are not sufficient, doesn't mean they're not important and essential, frankly, to the folks we're supporting. But we, at the same time, have to be thinking about what else and what more. If we can go to the next slide. We've been wondering, from your perspective, as you've been sort of wading through some of this, what do you think from your perspective are some of the capacities and supports that you or others who are hungry to step into that paradigm pioneer role might need? Really curious. And if you've played this kind of role in particular, what were some of the pieces that you found enormously helpful for you?
Resources here we have in the chat, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Change, engage people that think differently.
Support for failed attempts. That's a really curious one, right? It's, to me, it kind of reminds me of how we have to normalize failure and anticipate it, really, and not necessarily see it as a failure. Ashley's talking about how important it is to have peers, right? To help you work things through. Beautiful. All of these things. Yeah, I think it's really hard to do this by yourself. And many of you are acknowledging that as well, which I think is fantastic. So let's just bump ahead to the next one as we kind of work our way through. Great. There we go. So, I mean, I find this piece and framing from Human Systems Dynamic Institute also really useful and helpful, because what it reminds me is that some of the default tools that many of us are most familiar with may not be the best tools and frames for us to be using as we move into thinking differently about what our options are. And so the core sort of shift is not thinking about our programs, our organizations, our systems as like machine parts that can be swapped in and out and that we can control, but rather we need to, like the metaphor of that living dynamic forest, shifting, changing, might actually free us up quite a bit. And with that shift and our understanding of it really helps us understand new ways of thinking and new ways of working to really kind of harvest what we need to start mapping out options for the future. Let's go to the next one. I think it is this. I think it isn't just the programmatic solutions. And we've talked about that. We talk about this a lot at Tamarack. It's also about taking the time to say, what are the systemic elements that are holding or contributing to the problems that we're perpetually designing programs to solve? And as a paradigm pioneer, how are we identifying some of those and intentionally baking in strategies to explore and create alternatives? I also think that one of the other pieces, which is both challenging and creates neat opportunities, is this sense about not siloing. Right. So I'm thinking about the chat box and someone saying, well, there's COVID, but there's also all the climate change impacts, right? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work from Climate Interactive around multi-solving, but it's a new approach to challenge us to not choose. Do we fix healthcare or do we fix the environment, for example? But it's rather, how might we, in our work around the environment, really enhance people's health and well-being? And conversely, as we're working in health, how can we do it in ways that contributed positively to addressing issues related to climate change? So really not doing that either or, but really encouraging ourselves and each other to think bigger. If we can go to the next. So for me, I love story, right? Because story actually helps me remember some of these ideas in really practical ways. And many of you might be familiar with this story from the Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed book. But they talk about a nomadic tribe out of Ethiopia who are known as the AFARI. And they have existed for thousands of years in such a harsh environment where many other nomadic tribes have not been able to thrive. And they actually attribute their survival to a practice that's common in their community. And it's a practice called DAGU. And what it means or translates to is information. But it's actually way more than just data. Whenever two AFARI groups meet, wherever they are, the practice that is absolutely sacred is that they sit together in a conversation for many, many hours with one another. And they listen and they talk about what they have seen and heard from the places that they've come from, what's going on in terms of the folks in their circle, in terms of their health, but also the livestock and their health. They talk about and comment around political shifts and tensions that they are seeing. And so it's both an observation of what they're seeing and then their interpretation of what they think it means. And interestingly, they believe that every single person has an obligation to contribute to this because we are all sense makers. And it's only when we fully understand the perspectives of one another that we can make a richer assessment of what's really going on. And they use these conversations and the insights that generate from them to actually decide, are they going to stay put? Are they going to move? If so, in which direction are they going to move? And their belief absolutely is that every single one of the members of the community are needed to help make sense and be aware of emerging patterns that are showing up, both natural, social, political, and that rooted in that. And I think this is sort of a space I would love to more naturally step into, I think personally, not believing that I necessarily am going to be able to control those patterns that I'm seeing, but more that if I'm aware of them and can actually understand them deeply, I have a better chance of being able to work constructively with them. And if everything works the way we hope it would, maybe even nudge them in some real positive directions. And so I think what that reminds me about in these uncertain times is, how do we get better at sense making? How do we get better at watching for and seeing patterns and testing and confirming those patterns with each other? Because that is the clue or unimportant clue about where we might want to focus energy. Make sense? All right. So I think I hand back to you at this point, right, Sonja?
I think it's still you.
Is it still me? Okay, let's go ahead.
There's some interesting things in the chat as well.
So I think for me, this is that really tough tension, right? How do we continue to think about and invest in really advancing some transformative approaches to how we tackle some of our biggest community issues, but at the same time, do it in a way that's responsive, right, to community needs, and manage that tension, because I don't think it is an either or. And I'd love insights and thoughts from you all about what that might take. How do we structure ourselves to do that? What have you learned from your own experience about how this works well in your organizations, in your communities?
There's a lot of comments and themes popping up in the chat about resilience, having diverse perspectives, or greater stakeholders come together to get more perspectives and depth of understanding in the chat, which is interesting. Interconnectivity as well, which is interesting coming up. Beautiful.
I think this is exactly the kind of stuff that we need to be thinking about for sure. And that we all, it's hard, right? They're very different perspectives, and you can't necessarily always be in one or the other. You can, and so having colleagues that can say, okay, I'm going to be in the transformation space for a while. I need you to really kind of hold down the fort, and or vice versa, I think is really essential. All right, let's leap ahead to the next slide if we can. So love this. Again, drawing from the work of Mark Cabage, and there's a really great tool that he's posted, and the link is there for you, about the innovation ambition continuum. Because I think we're all bandying about, just like we bandy about this notion of disruption and seizing an opportunity, we also talk about transformation, right? So what does transformation really mean? Are we all on the same page about what that looks like? I really like the way Mark has sort of distinguished. Okay, so there's incremental improvements, right? Which are really assuming that we're playing the same game and we're playing within the same rules, but there's ways to make it better, right? Then there's reform-oriented innovation, same game. Again, we're not arguing that, but we're proposing new and or different rules, right? Mm-hmm. And then, sort of the most kind of out there in terms of both ambition and also degree of change is different game, different rules. And, when you were sharing the examples, right, about Netflix versus Blockbuster or some of those other examples, like they really leveraged because they saw a different game. They created net new rules for a net new game. And then everybody else had to kind of play catch up or not around that.
I just want to add one thing, Sylvia, in terms of this, look at this degree of change, like transformative innovation seems, it is the biggest magnitude. It seems like maybe the most difficult or disruptive to approach. But I thought it was really interesting in Mark's work when he actually gives a lot of examples of that it's actually not so uncommon, these huge changes. So outside of the private sector, if we take it into our kind of sector, the 40-hour work week, publicly funded healthcare, the legalization of same-sex marriages, and cleaner tech and energy. So all of these movements are in this kind of transformative innovation realm, which have become, it's kind of like that tipping point, when something at the beginning, when maybe the pioneers are carving the way or carving the path and really trying to get momentum going, there's a tipping point where it just becomes then commonplace and it becomes like the standard, which is what's so bizarre about disruption and the whole innovative process, right?
Right.
Like by the time it becomes commonplace, it's like, oh, you've already, like by the time it catches up to everybody, it's kind of like, oh, you've already missed that opportunity. So I just thought when reading that, it was really refreshing to see that it's actually within reach, and maybe some of these transformative innovations are things that we don't necessarily recognize or perceived depending on the context.
Right. And some of the examples that you cited are also really, though, banging up against some of our cultural assumptions, right? And they're disrupting some of those, which is maybe why they get rooted. But it also talks, that says to me, like, that's not easy work to do, right?
I'm getting to that one.
Yes. Which all of that kind of makes me wonder, as we think about navigating these times, rather than, again, falling into a trap of either or, right? Should we kind of be seeding opportunities for innovation along this whole continuum? Because it really is, if, as you say, transformation might be a longer term game, right? Is it even possible? Or do these things compete against each other? Like, there's so many interesting conversations, I think, that warrant some further exploration around this. But let's leap ahead, can we, to the next, because I want to make sure we have time for questions as well. And many of you have already put this in the chat box, which was really an affirmation for me, because as we think about those paradigm pioneers, not only are they kind of creating the new or examples, prototypes of what's possible if we think differently, they then become the bridge. They create the bridge for the rest of us, right? To move more smoothly from this promising innovation as the old system dies, to kind of scaling up, if you like, this promising solution, so it's more broadly accepted and more effectively kind of put into place, I think. And that's the key, another key component of the essential role that these folks play. So if you go to the next slide, you all, many in the chat saying, yeah, one of the things that actually helps sustain a pioneering paradigm pioneer is actually not having to be alone. Because it's a very lonely place to be, and you can make yourself, like, as you toggle back and forth between what you know and what you're starting to consider, you can get lost as well. And so I agree, this is like a real accelerated learning. And we at Tamarack just recently published a paper where we're starting to articulate in new ways, right? How we as a learning institute can play a contribution, or make a contribution that's value added to the work of these paradigm pioneers, right? So we help you find each other, right? So you can actually discover and learn from and accelerate your own pioneering work by learning more quickly about how others have maybe approached a similar issue, which might spark some ideas, might actually help you bring out stories from others to say, look, what we're saying is not so out there. There's some successes we can look to from other places, which helps people who are more cautious maybe be willing to step forward and try. But then we also notice, if you see in this picture, so part of what we do is we kind of help you find each other, make that change work simpler and easier. But then we start to see more clearly, because of our vantage point, maybe some patterns that are emerging, some experimentations that many of you are trying, and we might pull you together to help you consolidate and unify kind of the insights into a coherent kind of pitch. At the same time, we can engage those larger system leaders, right? And help them to look at ways to link the best of that bottom up innovative work that's happening in communities, and link it up to some of those system leaders who are in a different position and whose complementary work may actually accelerate and nudge us in positive ways, right? So really curious also about how this resonates for people, right? Yes, it is about linking folks together, but there are those other three dimensions of the role we believe are just as important to really help us collectively advance positive change in our communities. So there you go. All right, if we can jump to the next. The other thing that we've really begun to crystallize around is that there are some practice areas that really needed to be braided together to create the conditions for lasting community change. So community innovation is what we've been really focusing on today, but it's not community innovation alone, right? We're seeing these other practices as contributing important components to this journey. So collective impact, those of you who aren't familiar, is a very disciplined form of multi-sector collaboration, right? Which brings those different minds around the same table and creates a shared plan of action. Community engagement, many of you have said, yeah, well, the people who probably have the most knowledge about what needs to shift are the people who are living it every day. How do we bring ordinary people, particularly those with the most knowledge from lived experience of what's broken, at the design table with us as we think these things through? How do we lead together, right? Part of this is no one leader can probably do it all. And in fact, there's real important components around being trusted, right? I can bring a message, but if the community I'm taking it to doesn't know me, doesn't recognize me, doesn't trust me, how effective am I going to be? So we all have leadership to bring. And I remember someone saying, you know, ordinary people in our communities are the most untapped resource that we have to advance change. So how are we bringing that leadership forward? As you said, community innovation, really challenging people to think differently and break through assumptions and paradigms. And then lastly, this ongoing learning. If we think of change in these times as more like a forest, right? That's forever changing and adapting. How are we noticing those patterns? How are we testing and amplifying what we know works? Mm-hmm. And like in our experience, it's interesting, like maybe now more so, but historically there hasn't been like a university degree you can get in community change, right? And so what we've found anyway is that people who are in this work find their way here through all these different pathways. And part of what I love is we all bring that wisdom and that experience from those different sectors and experiences. And so I think hold on to that. Like, don't feel like you have to start new and throw away everything you knew before. Draw on what you already know, but then also really strategically ask yourself and your colleagues, like, where do I want to dive a little deeper? Where do I want to round out my own personal knowledge and learning journey? Like, what's next for me? What's your thought about this, Sonja? Because you're kind of newer to the whole Tamarack thing. Curious about where you're at.
Oh, I just love, I love how well articulated it is in terms of the 5 practices and all the value of being able to work, you know, not only in the learning center, but also with the communities and all the different, on the groundwork, and how that kind of creates a symbiotic relationship of interconnection. I think there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in all of that. So it's exciting to see where it's going. But particularly, I think, you know, a key aspect is that, you know, I think resilient teams, or teams that can have that flexibility, is there's a lot of opportunity in capacity building, particularly when it comes to, you know, disruptive leadership, when it comes to holding space for conversations, you know, basically all of these different areas, all of the practice areas. So I think, you know, it's really exciting to be able to collaborate with so many partners and learners to figure out where we're going to go next.
Well, and this conversation actually reminds me of, there's an urgency, right? Our communities need this. And frankly, might be leaning in on some of the recognized change makers in the community to really help guide a path forward around this. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. So folks, if you have not put questions into the Q&A box, or if there's something that's bubbling, or maybe there's one in the chat that you want to transfer over, let's make sure we hear from you all. But I'm going to turn this one over to you, because I think we're going to do a poll next, aren't we, Sonja?
That's right. So building on these 5 practice areas and what I've shared with them, we're curious to know which of these practices are you most interested in strengthening? So if we were to look at your current capacity, or something that you're most interested in or most relevant to your work, please let us know.
Oh,
yeah, that's interesting.
Fast and furious, really good. We're at 40%, guys.
Collaborative leadership. All right, almost there. Let's keep going. And in the meantime, once you've finished filling in the poll, if you do have any more questions, specific questions, ideas, ponderings that we can spend the last few minutes of our webinar on, that would be great.
We're at 73%. Can we get to 90% maybe? That might be a bit audacious, but let's give it a go. Couple more seconds, see where we're going to land.
So we have collective impact, community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, evaluating impact. Which one of these would you be most interested in strengthening your knowledge on?
Wow, very good. Okay, we're at 70%, people. 77. Look at this. We're going to break 80. Let's break 80 before we show you the results. Hold. One more minute. Oh, look at that. We made it. Okay, there we go. Do you want to show us the results? What do you think, folks? Wow, lovely. It's really a bell curve, isn't it? Fantastic. Well, thanks, folks. Let's move over to the question and answer component if we can. What are we seeing, Grace? I'm going to call on you maybe to start us off.
Sounds great. Well, yeah, I encourage everyone else, if you do have any questions, please just use the Q&A box. But we did see a question in the chat box. And the question is from Speedy Tata. So thank you for your question. It is, how do you engage community sections that don't trust you?
That's really a great question. Any thoughts about that, Sonja?
Lots of thoughts on that, because it's definitely, I think trust is is the critical piece of all types of conversations and collaborations and whatnot. So I'm trying to think of something. So I'm trying to dig up a
For
specific.
me, one of the things that comes up a lot, frankly, is that every time we seek to engage community, right, we're actually paying for the sins of all the failed engagement efforts that came before us. And so sometimes it's about not thinking we can just go out there and say, okay, we want to engage you, right? But also learning who are the trusted people in their community? What advice do we need to understand and know in order to responsibly kind of go out and engage community? Where is community already meeting? And I think some of it is like, if particularly priority communities can feel a little bit like guinea pigs, right? People come in, study them, get what they need, and then leave. And they never hear what happens, what difference, if any of this made. And so there's a real kind of relationship nurturing, I think, responsibility piece around circling back.
I think, and relationships are key to all of this work, really. We have a comment here in the box as well, maybe hire someone within the community or collaborate with organizations in the community, which is great. So there might be a bad relationship or maybe a difficult relationship, but I think with the right intention and as you said, identifying who are the pioneers maybe in that community that are, the change makers that really want to make a difference and, see if you can find common ground.
The other thing I love is there's a tool in our toolbox somewhere about the engagement continuum. And one of the things that they say is when you say engagement and I say engagement, there's like about 4 or 5 different ways in which we could come at that. And that trust is usually eroded when my expectation of the level of engagement and your understanding of the level of engagement you're planning don't line up. Right?
I think also in the practice of community innovation, that's the beautiful thing, is that it's place-based innovation. So it's, in collaboration with the community, where the community is leading the innovative process, whatever that might be, or whatever that might look like. So I think, too much, or maybe there's been a lot of extractivism in communities and maybe with altruistic intentions, but the lack of awareness of some of the power dynamics and realities. So I think that's definitely something that we should be aware of.
And I'm looking here, Amber, you just this beautiful quote in the chat box. Oh my God, guinea pigs. How many times have I been treated like a guinea pig, right? Multiple times, right? So it's like, that's a real experience. Absolutely.
Treading with respect in community work.
Well, and Deborah talking about, it can be really traumatic. And I remember someone in a priority neighborhood saying, having hope is a really dangerous thing sometimes. And for me to show up at an engagement session means I actually have a little degree of hope that something may change. And so when this is the 3rd time I've shown up, and Lynn is talking about it as well, like when this is the 3rd time I've shown up and I walk away and nothing ever changes, like that is the re-traumatizing. And it makes it that much harder for me to even muster it up the next time. And why should I? Right? Yep, dead on. Other questions, folks, coming up?
Yeah,
there's
so
2. Yeah.
We'll have a kind of a 2-for-1 because Janice also had a question, which I think will correspond together with Thompson. So the first part of the question is, how do you shift blame game conversations or prevent them from happening? That's the first question. And the second one is, in community engagement, don't we have to be explicit about what we want from the community and what we are giving them?
Oh, very interesting. I think for me, one of the big shifts is not going with an answer or feeling like it's more like going with a question. I'm wondering if I see this, but I don't pretend that I understand it fully. Help me understand from your perspective, what does this look like, right? I think there's that, and it kind of intersects a little bit with the blame game piece. where we own, too many times folks have come in and done to the community and come up with solutions that fall short. What are the things we need to think about and work with in terms, like, where can we meet with the community to better understand what your agenda is, what your priorities are? And I think that's hard. I think that's hard because many of us are in our own, accountabilities or sectors or whatever, and we have deliverables. So how to navigate that, I think. Do we have space to take on something that we may not decide, which may not be the top priority for us, but the community is saying, this is it, people. This is what we want to see first.
And I think it takes a lot of skill and capacity to have those conversations and to have the language around it. Difficult conversations that need to be had to kind of move forward. We're having there's a comment here in the chat box, Sylvia, that's where it left me now. Something about, what if a solution's not actually the right solution for the community, right? Whereas where the community engagement, authentic community engagement comes into play. Because assuming if you have the community stakeholders, not only the pioneers, but the broader stakeholders and community members come together, that their kind of vision will be included in that solution, in the creation of the solution. So as you said, leaving the assumptions aside before you go in and not having a formulated direction of where it's going without consulting the community.
And I think if it is an organization, like an organization driven kind of engagement of community, right? In some ways, I think it's about negotiating and having the tough conversations internal first, which is, what are we going to do if our priorities don't line up with the community's priorities? What kind of responsibility do we have to invest in and support community-driven priorities? And there's something else that kind of intersects with this for me, which is both citizens and residents, right? Who says it's the organization that's the only one who is responsible for delivering the solutions, right? Because we've actually also, this is John McKnight, right? Disempowered residents of community by doing needs assessment after needs assessment and not actually helping them to see beyond their individual skill, strength, and ability, collectively, what do we have, right? And how might residents, this is the collaborative leadership piece, be equally responsible and engaged in contributing to the kind of change we want to see happen. So I'm mindful of time. We've only got a couple minutes left. Oh, how did that happen? Thank you, everybody, for being so engaged with your thoughts, your ideas, your questions. I'm sure Grace is going to add the chat log, so we have that too. But over to you, Grace, maybe to wrap us up and take us home.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sylvia. So we'll just go down to the very last slide. Just a couple of announcements. We do have an upcoming workshop that is taking place very soon. It's in May. And just a bit of a backstory on it. Some elements were discussed today, the 5 interconnected practices. And so you're able to join over 200 community change makers from across Canada, the United States, and beyond as we explore the shifting environment in which we work and volunteer. So again, they're going to be exploring the 5 interconnected practices that are essential for community change. We're going to hear from a wide variety of content and context experts and how to build leadership capacities in a shifting world. You'll receive pre-event resources, coaching opportunities, and continued support. So you will receive a link to be able to understand how to get access to this workshop and all the other resources that were discussed today. But thank you so much for joining us and joining the conversation.